In New York is Carne, formerly the UK specialist on Iraq at the United Nations. Carne, from where you sit, this change of mind by Lord Goldsmith after a trip to Washington, does it strike you as plausible?
Well, it's plausible in that he changed his mind after it became clear to the UK that they couldn't get the second resolution through the Security Council, which earlier they thought they had required. So there's a kind of post-facto scrabbling for legal justification in it. But his whole narrative is undermined by two key facts, two key actions by the government itself. First, when they sold 1441 to the Security Council, British diplomats in the Council and in public made clear that it was not a war-authorising resolution, that it was, in fact, a last chance for inspections and for peace. And secondly, if the British believed that 1441 was, in fact, sufficient justification, why did they go back to the Security Council for a second authorising resolution?
That is...
Because when the Council...
hang on...
I mean, it undermines their own case.
Let's see. Why on earth, if the original resolution was adequate, why go for another one?
It was clear from what Lord Goldsmith said today that there were different interpretations of the legality contained within that original resolution, and that there were a lot of people, many of them in the British government, but also elsewhere around the world, who didn't believe it was sufficient. Therefore, as Lord Goldsmith said in part of his evidence today, the safest course was to reinforce the first resolution with the second resolution and to demonstrate to the world that you were prepared to go that extra mile to try to get the United Nations to confirm it. But there was a problem with
there's basically a gesture of goodwill then.
Well, the problem with the second resolution was, of course, that it handed a veto to any individual member of the Security Council. And that was why, clearly, the Americans weren't comfortable with that, and I suspect that Tony Blair wasn't either.
Carne, you're sitting there in New York saying this is nonsense.
I mean, this is just extraordinary. I'm sorry. I mean, the Blair supporters, the Goldsmith line is now becoming a sort of, you know, honest people disagree over the legal justification. This is just not plausible. If you going to the Security Council for a Security Council resolution is a very, very serious matter. You don't do it to clarify views amongst lawyers in Britain. You do it because you need that authority to go to war. Britain must have taken the view before going to the Security Council that it needed that second resolution. If it had already felt that it had sufficient justification in 1441, why did it go again to the Council? In fact, there's something worse than that, because if you go to the Council and ask for legal authority and don't get it, then you are explicitly not authorised by the Council to use force. You can't then go back and say, well, actually, the earlier resolutions that we had give us sufficient justification when you've gone back to the Council for a second bite of the cherry and been turned down.
Carne, do you find... Well, one of the things that Lord Goldsmith said today was that he had a conversation with Sir Jeremy Greenstock, Britain's ambassador at the UN, which had suggested to him that the French and the Russians saw no need for a second resolution. Does that strike you as plausible?
Well, it's a very odd story because the French and the Russians didn't want to go to war. And when the second resolution was presented to the Security Council, the French and the Russians made clear that they wouldn't let it pass, mainly because they saw it as seeking authority for war. This was the whole problem with the second resolution. When the British diplomats presented it at the Security Council, they were asked repeatedly by sceptical delegations, is this authority for war? And they were forced to reply, yes, it is. And that's why they didn't get the support in the Council. They didn't get the 9 votes that they would need to get it passed, let alone the assent of the permanent members who had a veto.
Now, another thing that emerged today, Lance Price, was this whole question of the absolute ignoring of Cabinet. This was a pretty lonely relationship between Lord Goldsmith and Tony Blair. It emerged today. The Cabinet really didn't have much to say boo to anything very much. Does that strike you as odd in any sense?
I think people will find it very curious that Lord Goldsmith and the other legal advisers weren't more closely involved in the decision-making as it went through. And I think that is one indication of one thing, which is that it wasn't just the legality that was important. It was whether or not there was a justification for going to war. That is something separate to whether or not it could be seen to be internationally legal. That was a very difficult decision that they had to have. But when Lord Goldsmith did then go to the Cabinet, having made up his mind, and said, but, you know, I've made up my mind, but there is still another point of view, he found that Cabinet ministers didn't want to explore that. They didn't want to carry on with the debate. They had the opportunity in the debate.
That's what he said today, at least. I mean, he said they weren't interested. It was just between him and Blair.
But this was obviously a very long way down the road. I think perhaps earlier on in the discussions, when Lord Goldsmith wasn't involved, they might have had more interest in what he had to say. By the time that he was saying that he had made up his mind, that was now in black and white. That was clear to them. They had other matters that they wished to discuss, which were the domestic implications of war, the foreign implications, the implications for Britain's foreign policy.
Con Ross, what do you make of that bit of his evidence today?
About not being consulted by the Cabinet?
The Cabinet not being involved at all. Essentially, it's just a relationship between Blair and Goldsmith.
I find it extraordinary, like the whole story that's being uncovered by Chilcot. I think it's reprehensible that the Cabinet didn't ask for more detail. I mean, there are many things that Chilcot has gone into, and that is welcome, but there are other narratives and stories and facts that are not yet being uncovered. I mean, for instance, why was there no proper consideration of the available alternatives to war? This has not been discussed at all in the inquiry, and it certainly doesn't appear to have been discussed by the Cabinet before they agreed to the war.
OK, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you. Now, in a